Good morning, guys and girls. I hope the vocab quiz wasn't too tough for you this morning. But if it was, then that just means you need to study a little bit more. And if it was not, then good job studying and be ready for the next one. Today, we're going to continue on with our Chapter 1, The Rise of Civilization. And the Lesson 2 focus is going to be the Neolithic Revolution. Now, the Neolithic Revolution is a shift from hunting and gathering to systematic agriculture. And that's a word that you're going to hear a lot in this chapter, systematic agriculture. This begins in various parts of the world. So we're going to look today and we're going to talk about the Neolithic Revolution, a movement, like I mentioned, from roaming the wild plains, following your food source of animals, to being able to settle down into one area. And this is really what begins our actual rise of civilization. Okay, so here's our bell ringer for the day. Let's look at nomadic life first. The advantages of nomadic life. The ability to continually find new grazing grounds. So there's always somewhere, if the crops, the food sources that the animals eat, if that disappears, you can always find new grazing grounds. So that was an advantage. The ability to move quickly when menaced by other nomads. Ability to travel to more hospitable climates. If where you were was too hot or too cold given a season, you could up and move because you weren't tied to one area. The ability to move to better hunting grounds. If the game went sparse where you were, you could always move to a different hunting ground to find where the game was. Now, here are the disadvantages of a nomadic lifestyle. The inability to establish long-term stable homes. Necessity of traveling with very few resources and goods. They had to travel lightly. They hadn't really domesticated very many animals as pack animals to carry their goods and resources. The likelihood of being run off of good land by hostile nomads. So other groups of roamers and hunters might end up in your territory, and they may run you off if your clan is not strong enough to fight them off. Let's look at settlement life. The advantages. You got the establishment of systematic farming, which is great because you can then feed everyone in your group. Hopefully that is the goal. The reliability of resources such as land and waterways. Predictable flood seasons in the waterways gave you valuable resources in water. When you're roaming, you never know when you're going to come across fresh water again. The ability to protect settlement from invaders. They built walls around their settlements. I have to go back one to the use of animals for farm work. They were domesticating animals under settlement life. And greater control over lives in general. You weren't subject to where the food sources were. You weren't subject to where water was or other nomads running you off of your land. You had greater control of your life. Disadvantages of settlement life. There was a reliance only on natural resources near the settlement. If there was something else that you needed or something else that you wanted that was a natural resource, be it wood, some sort of fruit or vegetable, you had to deal with what you had in your area. But then trade becomes big as we see surpluses in goods, and we'll get to that later on. The necessity of organizing people and institutions. If you've ever seen any show like Survivor, The Walking Dead, where these people are trying to figure out what is a hierarchy, who is in control, what is my job, who gives this person the right to be in control, those things typically cause friction. The last disadvantage is the development of defined and limited roles for men and women. So looking at that list, let's answer a couple of questions. First question, what might be the biggest motivation for nomads to turn to settled life? Think about that question, look at your advantages and disadvantages, pause the presentation, and I'll have an answer for you when you come back. The question is, what might be the biggest motivation for nomads to turn to settled life? And one of the possible answers are the ability to grow crops and have more reliable sources of food and water. That is probably one of the biggest motivators to go from a nomadic life to a settled life. You can grow crops to feed your peoples, and you have a source of water that is readily there and that you can use on a regular basis. Now, our second question. What might have been the major challenges of settlement life? Think about that question, pause the presentation. I'll have an answer for you when you get back. Our question is, what might have been the major challenges of settlement life? One of our possible answers is organizing the settlement fairly and coping with crop failures due to bad weather. Again, that goes back to our disadvantages of who's in charge, who gets what job, how do you disperse and give out food supplies to each individual. And if there's bad weather and your crops fail, you just had to deal with it. There was no moving on to another area and finding better weather or finding another food source. You had put all your eggs in that basket. So that was one of the major disadvantages to settlement life. Domestication and the Neolithic Revolution. So the first thing we want to look at are what was domesticated for consistent human use during the Neolithic Revolution. Now, again, we go back to this word domesticated or domestication, meaning of the home, something that they could use that they tamed from the wild beast or to agriculture. What was domesticated for consistent human use during the Neolithic Revolution? Well, different plants. You had crops. They provided a source of food that was more reliable than hunting and gathering. Wheat sources, corn. Well, corn comes later on once we get into the Americas. But you have these different crops that provide a source of food that are more reliable than hunting and gathering. Animals. Animals provided a reliable source of meat, milk, wool, and labor. They would use animals, obviously, to help plow fields or to help grind mill later on. So these animals were very productive and a very reliable source. Some of the animals that they domesticated, we'll take a look at a couple. You'll have to find the others on your own. The cattle was one of the animals that they domesticated. Neolithic humans found they could use cattle for food, for their milk, the blood, and the meat, and for carrying loads. Cattle were probably domesticated in the Mesopotamian region about 8,000 years ago, although they may also have been domesticated independently in Asia and Africa before this time. So we'll see that cattle is one of the major domesticated animals that they will use during the Neolithic period. In another part of the world, the silkworm. The silkworm was domesticated in China no later than 3,000 years BC. The Chinese kept the process of unwinding the filament of the silkworm cocoon and weaving it into fine cloth a secret for hundreds of years. Now, later on in our studies, we're going to come to a page, an area called the Silk Road. It is a literal trade road, a trade route from China to the Middle East. China was the only place that you could get genuine silk. They kept this secret closely guarded of how they actually unwound each little thread of the cocoon from the silkworm and used it into weaving these fine cloths. And obviously, if you've ever worn anything that was silk, it is a very light, breathable material, something that would have been heavily wanted in the Middle East once they learned about it. Here we have the Catalhayuk archaeological site. This is an image from the actual site dig of where they found this ancient village called Catalhayuk. Catalhayuk in Turkey was first discovered in the 1950s and excavated or unearthed by British archaeologist James Mellor in the 1960s. Historians believe that Catalhayuk was one of the largest Neolithic communities dating from 6700 BC. This photograph shows an aerial view of the Catalhayuk archaeological site. Researchers believe that as many as 6,000 people lived at Catalhayuk. Say that word 3 times fast. Catalhayuk, Catalhayuk, Catalhayuk. That's a good one, right? But this is an archaeological dig site. Here we'll have a recreation, a graphic rendering of what Catalhayuk might have looked like back in its prime. The houses were made of mud brick. They were packed closely together at Catalhayuk. People entered the houses from the roof via a ladder. Homes had hearths, ovens, and platforms for sleeping. So everything that they needed was there. Now, I do not know the reason why they wanted to enter through the roof. Maybe it was a structural thing. Maybe they had not figured out how to make an opening big enough for there to be doors. Or maybe it was a safety thing. Maybe if they were foreseeing hostile nomads at any point in time, they could pull their ladders up and you could not just enter the home on the ground level. That would give you a great strategic advantage in any type of warfare. Some houses had yards, probably for domesticated animals like cattle and dogs. And Oddly enough, the dead were buried underneath the houses. So the house would have been a mud floor, a dirt floor, and they would have just dug a hole and buried them right there. Maybe that was some sort of a ritual to keep their dead close to them, to overlook, the spirit could overlook over the house itself. Food for thought. See what I did there? Food for thought, and we're about to talk about systematic agriculture. Why do you think some historians believe that the agricultural revolution was the single most important development in human history? Think about that question for a second. Pause the presentation. I'll have an answer when you get back. Our question is, why do you think some historians believe that the agricultural revolution was the single most important development in human history? A possible answer. Your answers may vary from others, but you may mention that systematic agriculture completely changed the way early humans lived, making it possible for them to give up their nomadic life and settle in communities and eventually build complex societies. Now let's talk about the specialization of labor. What is the specialization of labor? Well, that is where you take certain groups of people and say, this is your job. This is what you do. And if everyone does their job, then it benefits the community as a whole. So what is specialization and what made it possible? Specialization is the performance of different jobs by different people. It was made possible by the surplus food supply resulting from large-scale agriculture. Now, the surplus food supply is going to be a big deal. When you have something extra, then you have the ability to sell what you do not need, and that is going to increase trade in our societies. Now, why is specialization necessary for civilization? Specialization allows for the development of an economic system based on trade. So let's say the classroom across the hallway, they have an excess, they specialize in making pencils, and we specialize in making paper. And we don't necessarily have to trade with them. We make our own pencils to go with our paper. They make their own paper to go with their pencils, but we decide we're going to specialize strictly in paper. Now, for every classroom that needs paper, we have the market cornered. We can produce paper faster than another classroom that is producing paper, pencils, and erasers. They can only produce a third of what we produce because we do what we do in mass. So now we have this extra, and now we can trade with the other classrooms that have specialized in their one product. If we only have 15 students in this class and we need enough paper for 15 students, but we make 30 pieces of paper, then we can go and trade those extra 15 pieces of paper for 15 pencils or whatever the market deems is necessary. So specialization of labor makes it possible for trade. Now, what trade does is it gets different groups of people interacting, and this is huge. Now we're going to start to see our civilization start to get what we call a cross culture. You'll see some things from other peoples being adopted by another group of people. You start to see language barriers break down. But trade can also instigate conflict, where maybe now one group of people sees that this other group has what they want and desire, and they're going to take it by force. So trade is the first social network. It's the first social network. It gets people interacting, and it's a big thing when we talk about the rise of civilization. Continuing on to the specialization of labor, there's the needs for defense and organization, such as government. These needs increase. As I spoke about, trade can instigate conflict. Now you're going to need this defense system put in place. Warriors, defense systems, different things, and organization such as government. You have this trade and barter system coming in, and money hasn't really been invented yet, but that's where it's heading towards. And then you're gonna have to set up a form of government. Who is in charge of protecting the common people on a day in and day out? Writing is developed to keep accurate records. So trade actually spurs the need for writing. Again, back to our analogy of our classroom. If we didn't have any method of bookkeeping, when we're trading our paper for another classroom's pencils or erasers, we need to write these things down. So writing was not developed, and it became part of society to keep accurate records because of trade. And this all goes back to the agricultural revolution. Had they not began domesticating plants and animals, for the agricultural revolution, there would not have been a surplus of goods. If there were not a surplus of goods, trade would not have been possible. And if trade had not happened, then this development of writing would not have happened. Artists communicate cultural and religious ideals. Now, this is huge too, because now part of the specialization of labor are the artisans. In every culture, you're going to find artisans. Artisans typically begin making things that are of necessity, bowls for eating, jugs and vases for keeping water in the home, from away from the water wells, and then these things start to turn into a surplus. They have what they need. Now they're going to make what they want. And these artists begin to relay the cultural and religious ideals of the day. Let's talk now about changes during the Neolithic Revolution. In the broadest sense, a revolution is any massive fundamental change. Think about that word revolution for a second. It literally means for something to turn. Our world, our earth spins, and we call it a revolution. Every time a tire or a wheel comes from makes a 360-degree move, it's called a revolution. So we're talking about a massive, complete turnaround, a fundamental change. Now, the Neolithic shift from hunting and gathering to settled agriculture fundamentally changed the way people lived. This allowed for the following developments. The specialization of labor, which we talked about, and we talked about what came out of this specialization of labor. Then we start the creation of cities, this revolutionary movement from being moved around as nomads into living in one place, the creation of cities such as Catalhayuk. The emergence of a barter economy. This is what we talked about, came from our specialization of labor, came this trade. The emergence of a barter economy, and where you trade things for other goods. Now let's transition just a little bit from out of the Stone Age into the Bronze and the Iron Age. Developments during the Iron Age. Developments in the use of metals happened during the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. This led to improvements in agriculture. So we're moving from stone-based, stone-made material tools into this bronze and this iron, learning metallurgy, learning how to smelt metals and to mold them and to shape them into tools that are much stronger, can be much sharper, can be used much longer than these stone tools. So this helps expedite the process, especially when we talk about agriculture. These harder metals made for better tools. These improved tools made farming easier, and agriculture could be carried out on a larger scale. Now, on the flip side of that, those are all civilian uses, but the Bronze and Iron Age usher in military uses. Obviously, it is much more efficient to kill, maim, or harm someone with a metal tool in war. So those who had a metal tool versus those who had stone tools, they will be more efficient in defending or taking over other territories. And this starts to spur later on through civilization, man's desire for the greater weapon. He who has the greatest weapon holds the most power. And that's what we'll see as time progresses through up into the Iron Age, all the way up into modern history. Fewer people were needed now because of these new efficient tools. Fewer people were needed to grow food to support a community. So then that gives others the opportunity to pursue other avenues. Maybe they begin to become educators. Maybe women can stay home or men can stay home, whatever the social structure of that society was, could stay home to become educators. Or men could take young boys out and teach them how to be hunters and warriors. There were less people that were needed to grow food in order to survive. Now you start to see a recreational atmosphere, an extracurricular atmosphere, the dawn of a new beginning. Time for a little more food for thought. Here's our question. Why do you think specialization of labor is so important to the growth of complex societies? Take a minute to think about that. Pause the presentation, and I'll have an answer for you when you come back. Our question is, why do you think specialization of labor is so important to the growth of complex societies? Your answers will vary, but you should understand that specialization of labor leads to a workforce that can provide a variety of goods and services. This will result in greater opportunities for trade with neighboring societies. And again, that trade increases the exposure within societies and increases different goods and commodities flowing in between societies, and we'll get to see a mixing of cultures. Let's now take a look at culture and civilization. We need to understand the differences in the two. And to help you understand that, we're going to discuss the differences in culture and civilization through this chart. And then later on, in just a little bit, we're going to look at the basic characteristics of civilization. Okay, so on our chart here, we have culture. Culture is the way of life of a people in a certain time and place. These examples include the Neanderthal culture in Europe 20,000 years ago, the Inca culture 500 years ago, or the Japanese culture of today. So that is our culture, is a way of life of people in a certain time and place. A civilization refers to a complex culture in which large numbers of people share several common elements. There are 6 basic characteristics of civilization: cities, government, religion, social structure, writing, and art. So what we see is that within a culture, you're going to have a civilization. So the culture is the larger overall scope. That's why it gets the bigger circle. Encompassing culture, or encompassing civilization, is culture. Okay, so civilization is a smaller niche inside of culture itself. It will have different variances in those ways. Let's take a look more in depth at the basic characteristics of civilizations. So within each culture, inside your civilization, you're going to have different cities. These cities are made possible by abundance of food, provide for new patterns of living. You're going to have your own governments that will organize and regulate human activity. You'll have different religions. These offer explanations of forces of nature and people's roles in the world. These are all different things that will be within your different civilizations. The greater scope of that will be your culture. Your culture of people is made up by your individual civilization. You're also going to have different social structures. These create class divisions based on political and economic power. What we'll see is what we have in our country today is typically an upper, lower, middle class, whatever. In other cultures, you're going to see a first, second, and third estate, like we'll see in France later on down the line. But this is just a way to divide political and economic power. Writing allows for the keeping of accurate records. Remember, this is prehistory that we're studying before they actually began to keep their own historical accounts. So these accurate records are mainly for bookkeeping and trade purposes. Then you're going to see art. It creates paintings, poetry, and other cultural productions. All of these things, these 6 things that we looked at, all of these go back to what a civilization is, to what that smaller group of people inside that area. So a civilization, if we were to look at it in terms of our own area, civilization could be how things work and operate in the A wing, the way that our social structures are, the way we write and produce art. Whereas over in the C wing, they may have different ways of setting up their religions or their writing. Their civilization is different, but together we're a culture of people. We are one group of people. It's a culture. We just have differences along the way. In review, here's what we looked at today in Chapter 1, Lesson 2 of the Neolithic Revolution. We taken a look at domestication of plants, animals for different needs, for different food sources, which helped the systematic agriculture, which helped the settling of cities and civilizations. We looked at one of our earliest finds of a civilization at Katahayuk and how they lived and how they domesticated animals and what they used for their purposes. And finally, we took a look at the differences in culture and civilization. That civilization is a smaller entity, a smaller niche with 6 markers. And you need to know these 6 basic characteristics of civilization. A civilization is a smaller entity within a larger cultural group. That brings us to the end of Lesson 2, the Neolithic Revolution. Please remember that your next class meeting, you will have a vocabulary quiz over Lesson 3. You also have your guided reading activity, which is due by midnight tonight. Do not forget to get online to the discussion forum and answer the questions. Post your own answers and respond to a couple other of your classmates. Please don't forget that you have your vocabulary glossary. Find your 2 words and enter those into the glossary. That will be a great study material for you down the road. Always have your eyes moving forward towards the prize that we're into almost to the 3rd lesson of the Neolithic Revolution, of the rise of civilization, which means our test is coming soon. So please study, please prepare. Don't be caught off guard for that. If there's any questions, please feel free to email me. There's also the Q&A forum that is online. You can drop a note in there if you have a question on something. And if you have the accurate answer to that question, to one of your classmates' questions, please feel free to post and get a community of all the world history classes answering questions for your classmates. It will help everyone learn that much faster. Thank you all for coming in today. Have a good day. See you tomorrow.